Greetings to everyone here in this room. It is a real pleasure to have you all here. With me today is Glenn Carle. Glenn Carle retired as Deputy National Intelligence Officer. He was the head of the Office of Transnational Threats. He had a long and illustrious career in the CIA. Some would say the dreaded CIA, some would say the infamous CIA. Glenn is an author, Glenn is a geopolitical analyst, Glenn is also a senior partner at Fair Observer Intelligence, along with Vikram Sood, who retired as chief of RAW, India's version of CIA. Now, on behalf of Fair Observer and IIT Gandhinagar, I'm welcoming Glenn. Please give him a big hand. And I invite all of you to participate once the question and answer session is over. We are going to have a very open, very honest, very frank discussion, not just about geopolitics, but about Glenn's personal life, Glenn's cultural background, and lots of other things. I am the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. I am Atul Singh. I'm your host. I'm also visiting professor at IIT Gandhinagar, and I thank IIT Gandhinagar for hosting us. And without further ado, here we go. So, Glenn, welcome to Meet the Spy. This is the name of the session.
Oh my God.
Exactly. Thank God for small mercies, huh? So, 5 of your ancestors were on the Mayflower. So you are, in some ways, Mr. America. Of course, Christopher, our Texan friend, may contend that. But my question to you is, what does it mean to be a WASP, especially a Boston WASP?
Oh, well, most Americans don't really understand the subtle distinctions of what a WASP is, and I don't expect anyone who's not American really to know. So, WASP is an acronym, W-A-S-P, White Anglo-Saxon, Protestant.
You're a bit red. The son of India is reddening you.
Yes, well, I am fair. So Anglo-Saxon refers to English, really, or it could be Scottish, from the British Isles, but not generally Irish. It is pretty specific. Protestant because the founders of America, the first settlers of America, or the United States, were Protestants.
Puritans, to be precise.
Puritans. And it is that group, those who landed at Plymouth Rock and were in the Mayflower. You may have heard of the first ship that arrived. There was a settlement a few years before, but they didn't succeed very well. Who shaped certainly the northeast of the United States, New England, where I grew up and where my ancestors arrived, but also defined really American culture. Up until, and were clearly the dominant group, socially, politically, economically, and until about the time I was born, until shortly after World War II, when America has since rapidly become more diverse, and access to power, prestige, and so on has finally come closer to actually embodying the ideals that America has claimed to live by or to strive for. So it was the original culturally dominant group that shaped American culture. And American culture fundamentally remains still a WASP-based or center-derived culture.
So what does it mean to be a WASP today, particularly a Boston WASP? Yeah.
Today? Well, today...
You're the villain, as per some woke people in the top universities, especially the Ivy Leagues.
I would say those who in the United States even know what a WASP is still probably view it as a sign of stodgy, old school, socially conservative, probably more class-bound cultural views. I think that is a stereotype, but all stereotypes are based on some truth. I would say that's probably what it is. Now, this is something that I'll say that even most Americans don't know. There are gradations, of course, within waspness, much like here, but we only are trying to copy our much culturally older civilizations. And what are called Boston Brahmins.
There are a few Brahmins, real Brahmins in this room.
Yes, are considered the most elite and the most original, but they also controlled the power and held the money in Boston. My ancestors were among the oldest, but never had any money, and so we are called swamp Yankees, as opposed to wasps.
All right, so much so for a historical background. You grew up in Brookline, which is a suburb of Boston, now a part of Boston perhaps, in a house in which many generations of your family lived. What was it like growing up in Brookline?
Well, I truly did have what is, at least in the United States, referred to as the all-American childhood and life. In the 1950s and early 60s, when I was a boy, kids wore jeans, but you would turn up the cuff, and you would wear a T-shirt, but it would have horizontal stripes. And then you would play baseball, so you would be walking around with a baseball bat and the glove on the end of the bat. And it was a upper middle class, by American standards, life. In my town, like everywhere, had its ethnic and religious and social gradations, but I don't know if they're too relevant for. I mean, I'm happy to go into them, but that's getting deep into the weeds.
You played hockey?
Well, I was
growing up.
Yeah, my father was a semi.
American football, which is not football.
Yes, yes. My father was. Maybe everyone's father is impressive. My father was a very impressive man, and he was a semi-professional athlete for years after his university days, and so sports was. As is the case for many WASPs and Americans, an important part of how to become a man. And so I also naturally enjoyed sports, so I played American football quite competitively and successfully, American football, ice hockey, and baseball. Nowadays, children will only generally play one sport. It's become, I think, unfortunately, more specialized and professionalized, and that has problems in it. But when I was a boy, one played multiple sports, and as I'm sure you imagine, you know, somewhat absurdly, sports is a major element in how kids try to get ahead and to get into university. That's not why I played sports. And I didn't need to be a good athlete to get into university, but many do. But I devoted most of my free time either literally to doing homework or to playing sports very seriously.
All right, so moving on to two stories which stick in my mind from your childhood. Both of them pertain to the Kennedys. One is about your father, and the other is about your grandmother running into Rose Kennedy. So let's have those stories.
They're good stories, but I don't know if I should tell them while being recorded, actually.
The Kennedys won't kill you, will they?
No, but I am a WASP, so I'm polite and never seek to disparage anybody. Well, Atul mentioned that I was born and raised in a town called Brookline, Massachusetts. It is I'm from Boston, is the city. The town is Brookline, and I could walk from my home easily to the center of Boston, to the State House or City Hall, probably in half an hour. So that'll give you a sense. It was probably 4 kilometers, 5, from my home to the very center of the city. But it was a leafy, very wealthy suburb, technically. In the 1920s, my parents also came from there. And my father, for a brief period of time, lived on the same street as the Kennedy family. You'll know that John Kennedy was president of the United States in the early 1960s. And the Kennedy family was quite prominent before then in politics. His father had been quite successful financially and involved politically, and his grandfather had been mayor of Boston, so it was a prominent political family. But the name Kennedy will indicate that he was an Irish Catholic American. And in Boston, in ways that even Americans from elsewhere don't grasp fully, ethnicity is almost all defining, and religion. Less so happily, less so today, than 50 years ago when I was, or 60 years ago when I was a boy, and less so, even more less so, than when my parents were children in the 1920s. What defined Boston socially, I mentioned, Atul had me mention a little bit that I am a WASP, is the WASPs, the Protestant English-descended Americans from Boston, ruled the roost. And there were really no other groups until the 1840s, when, with the potato famine in Ireland, there was a large immigration of refugees from starvation into Boston and elsewhere in the US. And they were Irish and they were Catholic. And you'll know that for hundreds of years, Catholics and Protestants have happily been massacring one another. 1/3 of Europe was killed in the 1500s in wars, in the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants. These tensions or strife continued when basically England invaded Ireland in the 1600s. So when the Irish arrived in the 1840s, they being Catholic, this created tensions for social reasons, religious reasons, class reasons, and so on. By the time I grew up, well, I always make the joke that America is an improvement on Europe because in Northern Ireland, people kill each other based on religion, and where I grew up in Boston, we only threw rocks at each other. So that's a big step forward. But I literally, in the early 60s, or mid-60s by the time I was old enough, there were streets in my hometown where my brother and I really dare not go because our classmates would throw rocks at us because we were the prods, we were the Protestants. A lot of Americans, when I say this to them, think that I'm exaggerating, but it truly was that way. So, go back to my father, long-winded answer, I'm sorry. In the 1920s, my father, for a time in our town, was living on the same street as the Kennedys, or perhaps the Kennedys were living on the same street as my parents. And it was the summer, and my family had spent the day at the beach north of the city, and they had taken the train and come back, and it was dinner time, probably August, so it was hot, similar to here, actually, I would say, in temperature in the summer. And so the windows were open in the home, and my grandmother, whom I knew very well as a boy, was preparing dinner. She was working around the kitchen table and the sink and so on. And my father, who was about 6 at the time, heard children playing outside. Through the window, the noise came in. And my father peered out the window and he said, "Mummy, I'm going to go out and play." Now, my father's grandparents were English, which is why he said mummy, because mummy is an Anglicism, not something that Americans say. But in any event, he said, "Mummy, I'm going to go out and play." And my grandmother, who was a very serious person, She was not jolly. Looked out the window herself and she said, those are the Kennedy kids. No child of mine is going to go outside with the son of a rum runner. Sit down.
So rum runner, just so that people have context, America had prohibition, believe it or not, just like Gujarat and Nagaland. So you were not supposed to buy liquor and perhaps, and of course, drink liquor. And the Kennedys, or Joe Kennedy, made his initial fortune through bootlegging, which is smuggling liquor, whiskey, rum, or whatever. Ho, 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 and 30 men on the dead man's chest, ho, 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 and a bottle of rum, or something to that effect.
Right.
So that was the initial foundation for the Kennedy fortune. So that's why Glenn's father was not allowed to play with the Kennedy kids.
And implied behind my grandmother's comment was the Catholic-Protestant tension, the Irish-English tension, the upright Puritan Protestant who thought that Prohibition, having no alcohol, was a morally good position, as opposed to the corrupt, uneducated, socially inferior, religiously dangerous others. So my father said, the end of the way he tells the story was, if only his mother, my grandmother, had not been so morally rigorous, that he might have grown up to be Secretary of State.
The Rose Kennedy story.
Oh, well, it's a variation on the same theme. My grandmother, since they were neighbors, and this is an era when there were no large supermarkets, there were small grocery stores, which was still the case even when I was small, was doing her shopping. She was buying groceries. I don't know what she was buying. And she, because they were neighbors, knew Rose Kennedy, who was the future President Kennedy's mother. And they found themselves in this small grocery store buying, bread or tomatoes or something. And apparently Rose was trying to be polite and cordial, and as they passed each other, she said, good morning, Florence, or good morning, or whatever it was. My grandmother's name was Florence. My grandmother said hello. And then just to make inconsequential but polite chit-chat, Rose apparently said, goodness me, or something like this. The groceries are so expensive, or vegetables are so expensive. To which my ever-cheerful grandmother replied, if you didn't have so many children, it wouldn't cost you so much. Now, Catholics had, in those days, many children, and Protestants had only 2, which is one reason why we are now a dying race, and the Catholics dominate Boston.
So the Catholics have inherited the world.
So.
All right, let's talk about Harvard. You studied there, you played ice hockey there, presumably you started learning French there. No, you learned it before. All right. Anyway, you are in many ways the quintessential Harvard man. How did Harvard shape you?
That's an interesting question. How did Harvard shape me?
Or how did you shape Harvard?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that we're all the same as we were when we were born. I remember very clearly, I truly do, what I was like at age 3. I really remember. And of course my character is the same now as it was then. I just am older, overweight, and have wrinkles. But I'm the same person, at least my character. But Harvard is a liberal arts institution, and that was in part what was behind some of my questions before we began, asking what your curriculum was. And I know it's an institute of technology, which by definition, or at least by title, is radically different than the education I received and the philosophy of education behind the education at Harvard. So liberal arts institution means the theory of a well-rounded, well-educated individual and citizen in the liberal arts approach is the way it was put at Harvard when I was there, and it remains true still, was that a Harvard student should know a lot about something, which is what the specialization, what we call the major, will be, and a little about everything. So you should have a broad education in the humanities, in natural sciences, and in social sciences. Those were the three areas that were required to obtain a degree at the time I was at Harvard. It remains fundamentally the same, but it has specialized. The thrust of one's education has specialized in the 2 generations since I was a student. So I had to choose a major. I majored in what Harvard calls government, but everyone else calls political science. I think it's better to call it government because I don't think it really is a science. It's more of an art.
It's better to call it politics, like Oxford.
I'm sorry?
It's better to call it politics, like Oxford. Government is pretentious. After all, Machiavelli wasn't in government. The greatest thinkers weren't in government. So I think government is pretty pretentious, in my view, at least. The Oxford view is that Harvard is pretentious.
Only a snob can know what that would mean, I think. So I chose government, and nonetheless, to receive my degree, all Harvard students, whether you were majoring in astrophysics or economics or government, Romance language, doesn't matter. You had to take certain requirements in the natural sciences and social sciences and humanities. And so I had to select some courses to fulfill requirements in each of those broad domains to become a liberal arts graduated, theoretically educated person. How did it shape me? I can't, well, I won't risk sounding pretentious. I will sound pretentious, I think. But, I've spent my life in elite institutions. I went to Harvard, and I went to a school called Sciences Po in France. I studied for a long time in France, which is an elite institution in the French system, very hierarchical. And then I spent my career, my adult life, in the CIA and working with, very closely, the Department of State, the foreign ministry. Each of those is an elite institution. And I can say without hesitation that the most impressive body of peers, of people with whom I associated in amongst those, 5 different groups and cultures, were my classmates at Harvard. I found it a scintillating experience, which is also, even though Harvard students at the time will tend not to admit it, quite intimidating. Unless you are pathological, you have to be a little intimidated because everybody there was the top student in everything. And then when you're all together, no one can be the top at anything, and that's how you've been your whole life, and that's very humbling, which is very healthy. So I would say that's how it shaped me.
Brilliant. Now, you're a well-read man. In fact, one of the most well-read men I've met in my life. And a question to you, a simple question to you, given that we have so many students here and we have so many viewers around the world, is which books have influenced you most? And which writers / authors / philosophers / historians / thinkers are the ones you admire most?
Well, I think this is a great question, and we could talk about this all night.
We have plenty of time.
This is where my mind and energy resides, I would say. But the most influential books.
For you, of course.
Yeah. I read one of my elective courses was Greek literature when I was in college. That was not a requirement to be a government
It should be.
degree holder.
It should be a
But,
requirement.
no, political philosophy was, in which we read.
No, but Greek literature should
you know,
also be a requirement.
We read the Greeks, but I chose, one of the courses was Greek literature. And so I read Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. And I refer to that frequently when I speak and write, and I think of it even more frequently. I recently, well, not recently, several years ago, I reread it from start to finish, not just selections, and it literally made me cry. I had spent, in reading it, many hours in communion with a man who's been dead for 2,400 years and is one of the great souls of human history. It was phenomenal, and it shaped the way I understand human nature as much as political dynamics. So that's one.
All right, Thucydides. So that's top of the list. Okay.
The works of Joseph Conrad, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's considered one of the greatest writers in English. He was actually from Poland and had been a sailor for much of his life.
Now, we met a sailor yesterday. We met the former chief of the Indian Navy. Possibly our best ever chief, Admiral Vijay Shekhawat, and one of his favorite writers is, of course, Joseph Conrad. The other, of course, is Anton Chekhov, whom he reads in Russian. And Glenn and the Admiral waxed lyrical about Joseph Conrad, who was a sailor himself and for whom English was a third language. His first language was obviously Polish, second language was French, and his third language was English. So I shudder to think how he might have spoken Polish or written Polish.
I perked up when the Admiral spontaneously mentioned that Conrad was his favorite author, and he didn't know that Conrad is mine.
Yeah.
Why was Conrad significant to me? I mean, for the same reasons he's considered one of the great writers of the English language and affects so many people. The fact that he was a product of his time and an ardent imperialist. He viewed the British Empire as a wonderful thing, is really secondary to or irrelevant to his writing. He explores the dynamics and the fears and the constraints, the aspirations of the human condition, of each of us, and the specific circumstances of each protagonist makes a story vivid, but it is secondary to what is the meaning of life. And I'll just give one little anecdote, which I think, from Conrad, that I think captures what he wrestles with in all of his works. I have a collection of his letters too that I read, and his nephew. Conrad must have been about the age I am now. I don't know. He was an older man. And his nephew wrote him. His nephew was in his 20s, and he was seeking his way in life. My mother sent me the book right at that period of my life. She knew me very well. And so the nephew said, "Dear uncle, basically, I don't know what to do. I can't choose whether I should be an engineer or a linguist or whatever it was. He was struggling with finding his way and, more importantly, finding meaning in whatever it was he was doing. And he said, sometimes I'm depressed and I'm down and I can't figure out how to, what is life? How should I live it?" And Conrad responded, and I'll paraphrase, but the writing is quite beautiful in the letter. He said, "You have a choice." And he anticipated by 2 generations the existentialists and Albert Camus and Sartre. And he said, "You have a choice in life. You can go through life with all of those around you smiling and laughing and seemingly unaware of their surroundings, but apparently happy doing the largely meaningless things day to day. Or you can be, you can struggle with the pain of self-awareness and doubt, but aware and conscious of the struggles, the challenges, and the ultimate failure that we all, that there is no perfection and no ideal. And he said, so the choice is, what would you be? An idiot, a smiling idiot, or would you drag the ball and chain of consciousness and obligation with you as you go through life? But you must choose. And that's how I felt about life.
All right, so we could carry on till tomorrow, but we at least have two authors out of you.
So he said, what would you be, idiot or convict? He was more pithy. There you go.
Brilliant. You did not mention Alexis de Tocqueville, but I know, and I know for many years, that you are a great admirer. In fact, you wax lyrical about Alexis de Tocqueville. Now, in our many discussions over the years, you've always maintained de Tocqueville to be the superior of Marx. Why do you think so?
Well, he had a more sensitive and I think astute understanding of human nature and of individual motivations. And he was less, he thought less in Platonic ideals and bloodless concepts, and more in.
So he was less of a prophet and more of a thinker.
Yes, why
and Marx gave us
act as they
Christianity
do.
without Jesus Christ.
Oh, Marx, I think that's very much the case. Yeah, you folks probably, I would be surprised if at this phase of your life, and given what your inclinations are academically and intellectually, to the extent I understand them, I'd be surprised if you had the chance or inclination to read de Tocqueville. However, certainly for Americans who study political science, government, politics, and so on.
I'm glad you're cottoning on to the Oxford lexicon already.
The book called Democracy in America, written by this man, Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman in the 1830s, is considered a foundational, central, essential text to understand what American society and culture are like, and what that implies for why American government and society is shaped, are shaped as they are, and what that implies for how social dynamics, how politics will evolve or play out. It's essential reading, and he was an aristocrat, but I would argue that it's not simply because he was an aristocrat, not only because he was an aristocrat, that he detected or was concerned about some of the implied organic tensions and shortcomings of democracy, and how that would lead to social leveling and pressure, if not obligation, pressure not to be too individualistic. It's always said that Japan is the most conformist society, but the social pressures, the cultural pressures in America to conform to the norm, well, I suppose in every society, but certainly in America, to conform to certain assumptions about what democracy is imagined to be, are very difficult to escape. And de Tocqueville saw this, and really the evolution of societies in an increasingly democratic world. And he was, there's been no one as perceptive as him.
All right. So, interestingly, you are friends with de Tocqueville's descendant. In fact, he was supposed to act the priest and marry you.
Not the priest. No. Protestants have no priests.
So he was supposed to officiate.
He's being provocative here.
He was supposed to officiate your wedding.
He was supposed to officiate my wedding. That's
Let's
correct.
be precise. Okay.
That's correct.
Jolly good. Now, what's the story here?
Oh, it was a moment of serendipity in life. I just have spent 5 minutes waxing lyrical about Alexis de Tocqueville to you, but when I was a graduate student, I needed a place to live. Where I was living, the lease was ending and I had to find somewhere else to live. And of course, as a student, you have no money. You shouldn't have any money. That's another issue. And so I saw a notice at the school on the bulletin board, this is pre-computer era, seeking a roommate. And it's common still, you share an apartment with other students to share costs. And so I contacted this person, and I went to, and he wanted to interview prospective people who were going to live with him and see about compatibility. So I went in and for the interview, and it turned out that he was a Frenchman, which perked me up because I had just spent 3 years, almost the immediate 3 years prior, living in France. And France is my second home, my cultural, where my love is, I guess. And so we were talking, and he said, well, what did you do in France, and why is France important, and blah, blah. And I just mentioned out of, I just said, well, gosh, if I have a hero, I don't have heroes, but if I had to choose a hero, I suppose it would be Alexis de Tocqueville. And the person reacted like he started at this comment that I made, and he said, why did you say that? And I said, well, and I explained why I liked de Tocqueville. And it turned out that this young man, also a graduate student, same age as I was, is the direct descendant of Alexis de Tocqueville, and he inherited de Tocqueville's chateau, because de Tocqueville is a count. And so he and I became roommates and very good friends, and we're still friends 45 years later.
Excellent. On that note, thank you very much, Glenn. It's been a pleasure. It's an honor. Welcome to IIT Gandhinagar again, and we'll now take you for dinner.
Well, that sounds good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.